Welcome. My name is Professor Ross Parry, and I'm from the School of Museum Studies at the University of Leicester in the UK. Leicester is the largest postgraduate training provider in curatorial training in the world, and we've been training the world's museum and gallery curators for half a century. From the mid-1960s, people from nations across the world have been coming to Leicester or with studying with us online across our postgraduate programs. It is a real delight, therefore, to connect and to partner with TyPA on this extraordinary program. An extraordinary program, not just in its generosity in sharing its insights through the cohort and beyond, but in the challenge that it sets us, a challenge to think about the role of the museum in this changing era. And in this particular axis, we're thinking about digital. We're thinking about the challenge and opportunity, the strength, but sometimes also the menace of digital technology and connectivity. And what does that mean for the museum? And it's a question that we've been wrestling with for several decades now. That idea of the museum and the computer, and the extent to which the computer disrupts our ideas of the museum. Those traditional ideas of the museum being a place, a physical venue, when the computer wants to think about the network. The museum that deals in artifacts and things of volume, things that are tactile, material, and yet the computer that wants to reduce things to ones and zeros, to digital. The museum that is all about sociality, of coming together, of being in a public space, being in society, being seen, being together. And the computer that deals with a distributed network that supports the sense of working together asynchronously or being a dispersed community of practice or interest or learning. The museum that frames a visit event and the computer that allows us to do so many different things in so many different platforms with so many different digital tools. It's an enduring question, this disruption between digital and the computer and the museum. But today, as we begin to think about new futures for our museum, we're still amidst a pandemic emergency globally, but we're allowing ourselves space to reflect upon how we might reset, reboot, reframe, refresh, as we reimagine what we may need to be together through the rest of the 21st century. As that happens, it's so appropriate to think about the role that digital has within this newly framed museum idea. And as we do so, let's remind ourselves that the museum is an agile thing. Despite that stereotype, despite that caricature that the museum is frozen and fixed and old-fashioned, we know the museum is vibrant. It's a mirror of society. It changes its shape, it changes its purpose, it changes its voice as society changes, to change society and to reflect society. We know that the museum, when we look back on those many centuries of evolution and change and development, we don't see a single shape of institution performing the same functions with the same tools and the same type of collections. What we actually see is a project in motion. We see an organization that's always changing, from those princely palaces that Europe built in the early modern period in the Renaissance, to those scientific projects meticulously assimilating in a methodical way collections of the world through the 18th century, through those grand civic gestures of the 19th century where museums were seen as civilizing places, to the 20th century, history from below, new voices, a place to learn, a place to play, a place inside the city and beyond, to now in the 21st century where the museum can be whatever we want it to be, and will be many different things in many parts of the world. So we know the museum as an idea is in motion. We know it's a project that is continually work in progress. It's something that's plastic and agile and flexible and nebulous. And that's probably why we love it so. So as we think about these questions of museums in a new era, and as we think about the role that digital will have within those, we can be empowered and we can give ourselves permission to imagine any shape future for the museum that we would like. Another context that I'd just like to share right at the beginning before we think about this idea of the emotional turn, which is the subject for this particular presentation, is another role that I have in the School of Museum Studies at the University of Leicester. So the school itself is very international, it's interdisciplinary by design, it's established, it's led also by research. So the faculty members there are researchers, leading scholars in museology and museum studies around the world, whether that's in museum ethics or social justice or design or well-being or paleobiology, paleontology or museum technology and so on. We together represent that defining characteristic of museum studies, that it's made up of so many different disciplines. So my contribution to that is in the area of digital. So I teach and I research museum technology. And for the last 5 years, I've been leading a project called 1x1. 1x1 is an international, it is a transnational research collaborative that uses a learning mindset and a research idiom to help build digitally confident museums. By learning mindset, we mean we don't assume to come with all the right answers. We assemble academics, cultural organizations, funders, policymakers, companies and consultants, designers and creators. We have an ensemble, a collective, a transnational collective and cooperative of experts and areas of interest. And we together use that research idiom. We use an investigative mindset to help us to understand what digital means to the museum today. Our projects over the last 5 years have focused on skills development. They focused on understanding transformation and change. And our latest project, as I'll tell you about shortly, is about leadership and understanding different forms of leadership within the museum. So we continue to work across the world in different settings. We may focus on one museum or a particular museums association or a cluster of museums across a city. And we will then work with them to help them understand a local need and to address a local challenge. And we will bring in the consortium that can help understand that. And then as we find out answers, not only will that help that local institution and that local community, but it'll be resources and tools and insights and frameworks and confidence and principles that we can then share, not just nationally, but transnationally as well. So as 1x1 continues, it grows its bank, its resources of tools and insights, and it shares them across the sector. We're open and transparent, we're collaborative and transnational. So the details of one of those projects is going to be what's at the heart of this talk. It's a latest project around modeling leadership within the museum. So that's me, that's the School of Museum Studies, and that's the latest project I'm working on at the moment. So what's the particular angle that we're going to take in this discussion then on digital skills? Well, I'd like to make a provocation. And the provocation is this, that there was something we forgot to think about over the last 40 years of museum computing. And it's a thing that's possibly the most important aspect of museum technology, and that's people. We focused a lot in these last few decades on understanding the technology. What technology should we procure? How do we make the hardware work, physically work? What cables and where? What software do we layer on top of that and put inside that hardware? How do we design that interface? How do we make one computer talk to another, or to make digital collections across our country and our sector and across the world connect and share content? We've been focusing quite rightly so much on getting the technology to work. What we then did for maybe 10, 20 years at either side of the turn of the century is that we try to then understand the business processes. We try to understand what a digital strategy would be for a museum, what policies need to be in place, what processes needed to be in place, what workflows, how would we project manage digital production in the museum if it was now stable and useful. So we spent 2 decades making the technology work. And we've spent almost 2 decades now understanding the business process and how to embed digital technology within our museums and galleries so that they are now confidently an innate part of many working museums today. But there was another part of that very classic triangle of technology, business process, and that final point of the triangle is people. We focused a lot on users, but one thing we haven't thought enough about, and what we're trying to address on our current research, and I'd like to talk about today, is the experience of using digital within the museum. The experience of the workforce, of going through transformation and change, of being asked to pivot to new digital forms of curatorship and communication. What is the emotional labor of using digital within the workplace? How do you lead digital change within your organization? How do you be part of an organization that's being transformed by technology? What does that feel like? And how can you help each other to enable yourself to be part of that digital change? So there's something important that's happening within museum technology at the moment. And it's an increasing awareness and discussion of that emotional dimension to being in the museum and working with technology, beyond the experience of our visitors and their emotional experience, but the emotional experience of leading, of curating, of managing and designing, producing and communicating through digital within our museums. It's about understanding the affective dimension of using digital in the museum. It's not just a business process. It's not just a machine. It's something that defines our curatorship and our identity and our creativity and how we work and how can we be a curator in the 21st century. That affective dimension, that understanding of the emotional dimension is what we are focusing on much more in our research. And it's what we're calling an emotional turn in museum technology. That word turn is interesting, isn't it? It's a phrase that sometimes gets used in sometimes quite pretentious academic contexts. We might talk about a philosophical turn or a cultural turn in our particular discipline. We saw, for instance, in museology, we saw a turn that took place in the 1970s and 1980s globally in museum studies. There was a turn to this sometimes called new museology. It was an intellectualization of museum practice, a subject that had been very practically orientated about how to collect and how to conserve and how to research and how to prepare and fabricate and install and communicate within a museum. But through the 70s and 80s, influenced by some leading thinking coming out of France, we started to think about other dimensions of museology. What was the authenticity of the interpretation that was on display? What was the mission and goal of the institution and how did it impact upon society? What was the experience of visiting a museum? How might learning work and meaning be constructed within that museum? Whose voices were being heard and whose voices were not being heard? And were those collections representative of everyone in our society or not? So that new museology gave us a new intellectual framework to think about museum practice. Other turns followed. In the 1990s, museum studies went through an educational turn, and we, in a non-negotiable way, positioned the museum as an educational organization, a place for learning, a place that a unique type of learning could take place within, unlike a classroom or anywhere else, a special place for learning, a social place for learning, for gaining knowledge, for learning new skills, for empathizing, for changing your own outlook on life, but for having fun and enjoying yourself as well. Another turn took place at the beginning of the 21st century, a social turn, as we began to think about questions to do with participation, democracy, inclusion, and social justice within the museum. Even within museum technology, we've gone through our own turns over the last 30, 40, 50 years. For instance, the subject in museum technology used to be called museum computing, and it was a very practical subject. And then probably around the year 2000, we started to theorize it more. We started to bring in media theory from digital studies. We may reach over to disability theory, or our colleagues in communication and media studies, or we may start to think about other questions to do with representation and authenticity and simulation and synthesis. We started to theorize our subject. And so the literature around the turn of the century began to change in museum technology, and it became more inflected with cultural theory. It became more theorized and intellectualized. It also started to historicize. One thing we did at the same time as we went through that turn from museum computing to the subject we now called digital heritage and digital cultural heritage is that we started to notice that there was a history now, there was a heritage to our subject of museum technology. We could look back on an evolution of practice. We could suddenly see a bookshelf of previous studies. We could see patterns and changes in the relationship between museum and computer. The computer was no longer new to the museum. It was no longer something other, but actually it was something that had moved into the institution. It was now defining the way that we manage collections and think about collections. It was present, sometimes ever present, within those interpretive media within the exhibition. It had become embedded within the operations, the finances, the managing of human resources, the other project management and communication within the institution. And it had become increasingly more embedded within the lives and the pockets of our visitors as they started to walk through the door of our museums with these extraordinary communication devices in their hand and all the possibilities for new connectivity with them that brought. So we started to historicize and notice ways of writing about museum technology that could take a longer view. And as we did so, we theorized. So these are both examples of turns that have taken place. And I'd like to play with that idea of a turn, of an intellectual shift, a philosophical shift, a re-emphasizing of certain ideas in this context of emotional turn. So that's what it means. It's turning towards more consideration of the emotional experience, not just of visitors, but of our staff. Another thing to say as we sort of come to the end of this sort of opening part of the discussion is around a longer trajectory towards that emotional turn. It hasn't just happened. It hasn't been something that's suddenly like a switch taken place within our academy and within our practice that we've now taken an emotional turn. Yesterday we weren't talking about emotion and today we are. I'd like to suggest that actually we've been on this journey for a long time. It's not that we've never thought about people within the context of museum technology. It's just at this moment, and maybe because of how sensitized we are of our own experiences and the world and technology because of the pandemic, it may partly be because of that experience that today that turn has become more discernible. But let me give you 3 markers just to help you think about a journey we've been on to get to this point of a new emotionality and a new sense of affect and the experience of individuals within the museum workforce and in the museum. Let's scroll back, let's rewind back to the late 60s and 70s. If you look at the literature around that time, and if you look at the way that the museums around the world were talking to themselves about technology, the individual within that discourse, so when it referred to people, it was done in a very anonymous way. The computer was a machine. Museum computing back then was called automation. It was about using a machine to automate manual processes that the museum already had. And any reference to people was very much as an operator. So in the handbooks and the manuals and the guides that we wrote about technology then, it was always about operational efficiency and how the machine will work. And the person was almost part of the machine. They were just an input and output device to make the machine work. So it was about how the technology could be used. And then through the 1980s into the 1990s, we saw a shift. If we look at the literature and we listen to the conferences and we see those discussions from that period at the end of the 20th century, what we see is a new awareness that operator is actually an individual, and that individual can exist outside of the system. So we started to write about interface. We wanted this machine to be useful for that individual, that user. We were suddenly aware that those individuals may have different needs. I have a visual impairment. I need my computer to be arranged in a certain way so that I can see it and I can interact with digital life. So we thought more and more about accessibility. We thought more about how a system might be adaptable by the user. They can change it, but also a system that was adaptive. It could learn and it can assemble itself for the needs for that individual. We thought about digital suddenly being something that could be personalized. So whereas that first generation of museum computing was about operation and efficiency and was very technocratic, the second wave of museum technology was much more about personalization, was much more about interface, was about use, was about accessibility, was about interaction and design. In the last 10 years, another phase has come to us. And this is this long journey towards the emotional turn. If we look now at those conference papers, those papers by curators, the way that we write for each other and the way that we talk about museum technology to our stakeholders and our constituencies and our communities more widely, if you listen carefully enough and you look, you'll notice that that person has now evolved again. They've evolved from being an anonymous operator to being an individual outside of the system with their own identity, to now being an actant within the world. When we write about digital now, we write about how it can be useful for us in the world. We know digital is just one small part of a connected globe. And whenever we create digital content and make digital assets available in the museum, we want to see them being used. We want them to have effect. We want them to have impact. We want our users to remix them, reshape them, for those assets to have agency, and then for those individuals to have agency actively within the world. So when we look at the role of people now in museum technology, it's not about the operator. It's not about the individual, even though they're still there. It's now about the actant. It's about empowering and enabling that individual citizen in the world. It's a shift from thinking about use to thinking about user to thinking about that digital content being useful. So let's recap. We think there is a need now, and there is a growing emphasis to start thinking much more about people within that triangle of technology, business processes, and people. The other two parts of the triangle have been looked at so hard over many decades. It's time to turn our focus to people. As we do so, we'll notice that that shift isn't going to be a sudden change, that we've been ready for this over many decades, because in our discourse within the museum sector, we've moved from thinking about individuals as as anonymous operators to suddenly individuals with their own identity and needs to now empowered actants with agency in the world. So we're ready to have this conversation. And as we do so, let's maybe call it a turn. Let's call it an emotional turn, because that's the phrase that's been used in other parts of our practice. What I'd like to do is to now change the emphasis a little bit. And for the kind of the middle section of this discussion, I'd like to tell you a little bit about one of the projects that we've been leading at Leicester, because we think, or I think it perhaps gives a really helpful, practical sense of what I've just been talking about, because what I've just been saying is quite abstract and quite theoretical. So let's try and ground it into some real things that we've been trying to do with museum and gallery practitioners. One way that we have been working together at Leicester and with our partners around the world, and we've been partnering with the Science Museum in London, the V&A, the Victoria and Albert Museum, National Museum Wales, National Museums Scotland. Our current project sees us working with units across the Smithsonian Institution in the USA, so the National Air and Space Museum, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum in New York, and the American Women's History Initiative, which is a cross-institutional initiative. And by the way, our project has also brought the UK Museums Association into partnership with the American Alliance of Museums. And on top of that, we've also brought the UK Museums Computer Group, some 3,000 members that it has, and it's been active since the 1980s, with the US Museum Computer Network, with a story that goes back to 1967, so 2 communities of practice. So as we've brought that network together, and the University of Leicester and also Southern University at New Orleans, and Dr. Hytham Eid, who's partnering us now on a new National Endowment for the Humanities funded project, which I'll tell you about later. As we've been working as that consortium, we've centered upon 3 key words that we think help us to understand and see this new emotional turn in museum technology. And these are the words. We think any museum thinking about its place in the world today, and any museum that's thinking about the role of digital skills and change in this moment, this era of change, would benefit from thinking about these 3 fundamental principles: being contextual, taking a holistic view, and being purposeful. And I'll take a moment to explain what I mean by each of those, and hopefully together they'll give us a really good sense then of what we mean by this new emphasis on the emotional. Our idea around being contextual is about flipping and turning the question that we've been asking in museum sector for many decades. For many decades, we think we were asking the wrong question. We were saying, what are the skills? What are the digital skills that the museum curator will need in the 21st century? And that's erroneous. That's a fallacious question, because it assumes that there is one single list. You know, we can laminate it on a card and say, there we go, there are the 10 things that every curator needs in the 21st century. And we were trying for many years, if not decades, to understand what are those needs? What is it that we should do as a museum to become digital? And our research, and this is research over many years now that has been action research, embedding researchers in institutions, our research has said that's the wrong question. The right question is to turn to a museum and to say, what do you need? Each museum is different in its size, in its governance, in its history, in the shape of its collections, in its place within community, in its voice and brand and identity, but also it's different in its journey. Each museum is on a different pathway to digital maturity and at a different point on that pathway. So the volunteer-run rural heritage centre has a very different set of digital priorities to the contemporary art space with no digital collections, but specialising in internet art, and a very different context and digital priority to the big national museum seeing itself as a world brand with 800 members of staff and a diverse collection and a huge digital department. Those organizations can't share a single pathway to digital maturity and digital change. Each of them needs to be understood on their own terms, and each of them needs to articulate their own understanding of what digital is and what it means to them. So we've been coming up with some resources that help museums to do just that, to help them find the words, to find the granular elements, the building blocks, to logically articulate what they are. So we have this deck of cards, and we can make this available to you. We're at the point of being able to give this away on our website as well. So you'll be able to have your own deck to play with and to work with in your own institution. Something you can do on your own with your team, or actually part of a big strategic discussion for your whole institution. One of the parts of the deck asks you, what do we mean by digital? And by thinking very carefully and looking at digital literacy models in so many sectors and industries and doing an exhaustive literature review and consultation, we got it down to 4 words. For the museum sector, we think digital is something you use. So digital can be a tool, but digital is also a strategic priority. It's a mindset in the organization. It's a way you manage things. A head of digital or a director might say, where are we with digital? Or we are a very digital organization. They're not referring to using the hardware and software. They're talking about how digital is embedded within the mission and the aims and the vision and the brand of the organization and its day-to-day operation. But it's also about how an institution chooses to manage and build and create digital things. But for the museum, and by the way, this is different from other industries, whether it's leisure or publishing or gas and oil or security or healthcare. For the museum, we create digital things, but we also collect digital things. We have a very interesting relationship with digital society and digital assets. So for the museum, a museum may use digital, it may manage digital processes, it may create digital assets, a game, a film, a social media feed, but then it also may collect digital assets from the world that are part of our collective identities and histories for the future and posterity. But for the museum, digital is also a societal and cultural context in which the museum sits. Museums are that mirror of society. They are that catalyst in society. They are that safe place within society. They are that rendezvous place of belonging in society. They are that creative space within society. And consequently, museum has to listen and look carefully about the characteristics of that culture and society that it is within. And that means understanding digital culture and understanding the role that digital has in the lives of the community. So this is very complex. If we pause and just think about what is digital for the museum, it's something the museum uses, a tool. It's a process the museum manages. It is assets it collects, but also things it produces. But it's also a cultural condition that it needs to understand and possibly even research and reflect in its exhibitions. There aren't many institutions and industries in the world, sectors in the world that have that relationship with digital. And one of the things that has been difficult for us is that we haven't been able to describe digital clearly enough in our discussions and in our strategies. We think this is one way that we can begin to talk more clearly and be more focused about what we mean, which aspect of digital is important to you and your team. Another aspect of this is about understanding why you want to develop digital. Which part of digital is it that is important to you? And here's another model that we've been working with, and we've been using this within workshops and development discussions and away days with museums across the UK and then in the USA. And over the next 3 years, we're partnering with Surface Impression and Culture 24 to run a learning a program across Canada, thanks to the support of the Canadian Council for the Arts. And it will be this deck that we'll be using to help us with that. So in this particular context, We see digital as maybe something, it's an action. Your relationship with digital is that you know how to use digital. But with digital and digital skills, you also achieve things with digital. And sometimes we mix up that competency and capability. But the third thing we need when we think about skills, because that's what these three cards represent together, the final part of developing a digital skill is our reflection, is our ability to consider whether that skill is successful or valid or could be developed in another way. So for me to be capable with digital, I need to be able to use digital, have a competency, but I also need to be able to reflect on my ability as well. So the capability is made up of the literacy and the competency. And again, that's something we haven't been clear enough about up until now. We've kind of mixed things up and just talked about digital skills, when actually as an organization and as an individual, you are so advantaged when you can be more precise and say, I know how to use digital. The thing I want to develop is my literacy around digital. Or I'm very literate around digital and I know how to use the tools. The thing I need help with is achieving in the museum context and improving my capability of achieving certain intentions and outcomes within the museum. Let's put it another way. Plainly put, my competency is my ability to, bang in a nail with a hammer and nail and to use a saw and use tools. My capability is, can I use a hammer and nails and wood to make a chair? So I've applied those competencies to the capability of designing a chair and building a chair. My literacy is me stepping back from that chair and suddenly realizing whether actually I should have made a bench, or to realize that my chair only has 3 legs, but I understand in the rest of the world 4 legs can make an even more effective chair. In a museum context, I might know how to send a message on social media. That's my competency. My capability is I know how to use that competency to run a social media channel and be a voice, trusting and aware and mindful of a museum and run a social media campaign. That's my capability. My literacy is my ability to step back and think, should my museum be doing that? Is that ethically right, the way that we are interacting with those conversations and those communities? Or is that social media channel the right channel for our museum? Maybe we need to use this alternative platform or channel, and that's the literacy. So one by one has been helping museums not only to understand which aspect of digital it wants to develop, but then which part of its skill it needs to focus on. Let me show you one final thing here. And that's the other thing that we've been helping our partners with. And this is about another aspect of context. One confusion that can take place and has taken place over many years and decades in many different museum professions around the world is that we mix conversations about what I need as a person with what my team needs in my museum, what my whole museum needs, and maybe what my sector needs, or maybe even what society needs around digital development. If you try and consider all of those at the same time, it makes little sense and the conversation becomes inconclusive and we talk at cross purposes and we achieve little. So another thing we've been helping museums to do as they think about digital skills development is to help them as they start to talk to each other in their own museum and to reflect themselves on their own priority, is to think, what's my subject here? What is the context at the moment that we need to be focusing on? Is it about me as an individual? Is it about my role in my organization? Is it about me and my community of practice, me and other designers across the museum sector, me and other history curators, me and other directors of museums? Or is it about my sector more widely? Is it that the museum sector in this country needs to develop a new approach to social media or cloud computing or augmented reality? And actually, it's not just on me and my museum. This is something we all need to develop. Or is this a much wider question? Is this a question about duty of care and safety and abuse online? And what do we trust on the internet? And actually, this isn't just the museum sector's challenge. This is a challenge for the whole of our society and our culture. This deck of cards helps you to just start to articulate what frame of reference you're thinking about when it comes to digital. I will just show you one last piece, which actually in a way forms a very good bridge to where we need to head next. And that is around empathetic leadership. So we're also helping museums to think then, now that they know what aspect of digital, what skill, what context, what types of approaches may they need to bring to lead digital and support digital change. And we've developed this idea, and this is Dr. Lauren Vargas, one of the key researchers on our project. She's developed this approach called CALM, about helping museum practitioners reflect upon how they collaborate, how they anticipate work in the institution, how they can let go of command and control, hierarchical approaches to leadership, how they can be mindful of the needs of the team around them, how they can then take care, reflect upon the modes of communication that they take, be ready to adapt their approach with digital media. Know that digital is always going to be changing, so build a resilience, assume the museum adapting to digital all the time. But as you do all of this, have embedded within you an empathy, have within you an understanding that this may be hard for some of our practitioners, and there will be an emotional labor that goes with seeing through this digital change. So we're able to sit down with practitioners and say to one individual, or help one individual to identify that their needs around digital are very personal. It's about what they can do with technology and how they can use a particular technology. You know, this may be someone who says, the priority for me is learning how to use this database in my museum. But there may be another museum we can sit with who say, actually, the need for us is at an organizational level. It's our capability, our process ability to be able to, manage digital at an organizational level. We don't have a digital strategy. Just by laying down 3 cards, those 2 needs now have been very clearly differentiated and identified. Or it could be, like in this meeting now, in this session now, it's a community of practitioners that are reflecting together on a literacy need they have about understanding digital change in our society. Again, 3 cards allows us to then identify that as a very different type of need. Just a couple of comments then, before we start to bring this session to a close. What we've also been doing on One by One, as we take people on this emotional turn to start reflecting upon themselves, to be mindful of the needs of others around them, to realize that there are different digital journeys that different practitioners are on, and that there are different digital journeys that different museums are on. The other thing we've been doing is taking what we call a holistic approach. This says, if you want to think about digital skills, if you want to think about digital change in an era of change, you need to think about every single aspect of your museum. You need to think about the visioning, what the extent to which digital forms part of your digital, forms part of your museum's vision, because that will prioritize digital for your institution. If digital is there in the organization's sense of itself, then that gives permission for the organization to use digital. And digital is not always having to make a case and try and catch up. Leadership and leaderful behaviors in the institution are what will then activate digital to suddenly enliven within the museum. This isn't just the chief executive who has responsibility for digital, but this is the way that everybody, every day, can lead with digital in their behavior. So we talk to museums about their leaderful behaviors with digital and how everyone in the organization can help activate digital. But we also ask museums to think about the systems and the processes they have in place, because that's what will enable digital to happen. You may have a wonderful vision of digital change. You may have motivated leaders with wonderful behaviors around wanting to do digital. But if you haven't got the systems, and you haven't got those business processes maturely in place, digital's always going to find it hard. There's no rails for it to run on. In terms also then of culture, that we ask museums to think about the atmosphere, the value, the behaviors, the vocabulary, the way that things are endorsed and rewarded within the organization. If digital is seen as good, if digital is seen as something with legitimacy and significance because of the day-to-day culture in the organization, that will also enable digital to find its maturity and to thrive. But it will always be people that drive digital. And again, it's coming back to the emotional dimension. Manage with empathy, lead in a mindful way, be aware of the emotional labor of individuals learning new digital skills and developing new digital skills. It's those together then that allow us to think about this kind of matrix of digital change. Finally, a comment on, as I come to an end now, on just what we mean by purposeful. We say that as well as thinking about museums in this contextual way, understand where you are and then think about your whole organization. What we're also seeing in our research is the power of thinking about digital and digital skills in a purposeful way. Don't just do digital because it's operationally efficient. Don't just do digital because other museums are. Don't just do digital because there's something shiny and exciting about the gimmick of having a digital interactive in your gallery. Digital will thrive. Digital will be authentic. Digital will work within your organization when it is clearly aligned to the social mission of your institution. Digital transformation within museums now is starting to understand more and more its role in delivering the social purpose of the institution. Just like our work, our socially engaged practice and our socially purposeful work in the museum is now starting to understand that not only is that work taking place within a digitally mature museum, but it's happening increasingly within a society that is itself becoming more digital. So to think about digital transformation today is inevitably to think also about being socially purposeful. And we have a phrase for that. We call that being digitally purposeful. I'm just going to make a final couple of remarks now before perhaps we have a conversation. And I just want to say where we are and how this emotional turn is now affecting the next phase of One by One. Our One by One project has in the last few months started its third iteration, its third edition. And this project is seeing us work with museums across America and across the UK with the support of the two museums associations in the two countries. Our latest project has 3 research tracks, and I'll leave you with this because just the name of these 3 research tracks perhaps speaks volumes. It says so much about how far we've come and how different now our priorities are to museum technology. Our first track is around empathetic leadership. So we're understanding the skills that are needed from leaders to help them to lead teams and to lead institutions through digital change and transformation. The second track is on agency and precarity. So this is a track where we are doing ethnographic studies inside institutional ethnographies, sitting inside museums for 3 months, our partner museums, observing the day-to-day, everyday experience of museum workers with digital technology. We want to understand how much agency individuals feel they have with technology in their organization and what voice they have to shape technology within their organization. That's a type of study that's never really been done before within our sector. But the third, and my final remark, the third track is perhaps the most important and the most significant of the 3 tracks, and that's a track on diversity and inclusion. With our partners at Southern University New Orleans, which has the designation of a historically Black college and university, HBCU in the United States, Hytham Eid, supported by a National Endowment of Humanities grant from the US government, is helping us to understand who's in the room. He's giving a paper at the American Alliance of Museums conference with a panel of amazing practitioners across the US sector this year. And that panel session is called Who's in the Room? And it's finally confronting questions around diversity, equality, inclusion, and access within the museum technology workforce. It's about trying to think about intersecting, not siloed, but intersecting questions around gender and the influence of women in technology or not. It's about understanding disability and the extent to which the new digital workplace we're making for museum workers, the extent to which that is accessible or not for everyone. But because of the important circumstances of the public debate in America now, we're also asking some very difficult but incredibly important questions around cultural identity and around racism and around prejudice. We want to understand the identities of the individuals that have power and leadership around museum technology and who doesn't. And we're going to be helped by Southern University at New Orleans and its particular perspective and lived experience of these questions for that research. That takes museum technology research and discussion and practice to a very different place. If we think back to those days of the manuals and guides and the user just being an operator, even to thinking of those days when we were understanding different needs of individuals working with the interface, today we're now asking some fundamental sociological questions about the identity of the individuals that are working with technology in the museum. This is about understanding mindful behaviors. This is about understanding precarity. This is about understanding the agency that individuals have within the museum. This is about understanding what is it to be an empathetic leader. This is about understanding the affective dimension of museum work with technology. That is our emotional turn in museum technology, our emotional turn in digital cultural heritage. It's about remembering that technology within the museum will always, yes, be about our hands and what we can create. And yes, it will always be about our mind and our heads and what we can think about. But it's also going to be a matter of heart as well. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you for allowing me to share these ideas around the emotional turn in museum technology.
Thank you, Ross. I mean, I think I'm touched and moved by your talk. I think it gives us a scope of what museums can be, and gives us some. At the same time, it reaffirms that we've been doing something. It's not that we are discovering this as a first step, but we already done something in the past that allows us to take this further step, which again reaffirms our confidence and gives us hope. And I wonder if this is a research project, or have you already applied this to different museums as a way of assessment to museums? Could you tell us a bit about that?
Oh, America, thank you for your generous feedback as well. And I think your word hope is for me the touchstone word, and that is always my outlook in this meta modern context. I think we can be hopeful of the power of what we can do together. Yes, I can talk hopefully quite directly to how we've applied this. And that's because our methodology through the projects of One by One has been action research. So that even though I'm showing you cards with concepts on and I'm talking in the abstract here, every single project we've done has been a research partnership with museums. So our first project that ran from 2017 to 2020, we had 6 museums across the UK, in Brighton, Derby Museum, the amazing Museum of Making that's just opened in the last month in Derby. Incredible. Tony Butler and Hannah Fox there that have envisaged this incredible building and museum about making in one of the world's first industrialized factories, which is now the museum. Derby Museum, the Museum of London, the National Army Museum, as well as National Museum Wales and National Museum Scotland. In each of those institutions, we had a researcher embedded for a whole year, and each researcher was helping the museum to reflect upon a different aspect of that holistic list that I gave you. So for instance, a lecturer called Dr. Marco Masson, who is now a lecturer in design at the University of Northumbria in the northeast of England. He was embedded within Derby Museum, and he was helping the organization to reflect upon the role that digital had within its visioning. And so he was in the room when a brand new museum was coming to life, and he was able to observe and facilitate conversations around how might we embed digital within the vision of that institution. We had Dr. Karen de Wilt, who is now a lecturer in museum studies in Leiden, in the Netherlands. She was embedded within a new media department in Edinburgh, in the National Museum of Scotland. She practically helped the museum to get its HR department, its personnel department, to start working with the new media department so that everyone in the organization, so they could imagine how everyone in the organization could do their annual appraisals, their reviews, where everyone in the organization could have an opportunity to reflect upon their digital skills. And I can give you other examples as well, but I won't, about how Lauren Vargas in National Army Museum sat with the director and was able to think about new models of leadership around digital, or how Dr. Sophie Frost, who is one of the postdoctoral researchers on our current project in Brighton, how she helped the organization to gain what she calls digital courage by helping it put a podcast together, a staff podcast. So we have practical case studies that sit on our Digital Pathways platform with Culture24, and I can share the link with you, Americo, where your learners and your wider cohort and community can see these stories, these 6 practical stories of how we changed museums, how we changed these 6 museums by helping them reflect upon digital transformation in this way. And we go on doing that. Our project last year and our project over the next year and a half, these are action research projects. We do something real locally that changes something in an institution, from which we can learn some higher principles. We can inductively reason some wider helpful insights, but it's always practically helpful for real museums on the ground day to day.
And I see, as you have described the accomplishments, what were the challenges and what did you find? Because sometimes one learns more from the difficulties than from the opportunities that went successfully. And what did you find that was difficult to apply in museums, or maybe negative reactions among the museum staff? Or
I think you Americo, as ever, you've absolutely seen to the heart of this. I may go as far as to say that when things don't work, and when we encounter a wall, and when we trip up, and when we're not successful with our activities, we probably learn more. So when Yoti Goudas, who had many years experience of being part of digital transformation for the Canadian government, when he was embedded in Cardiff in National Museum Wales, he found it really difficult to change the culture. His job was to look at culture and to think about how he could create an excitement around digital and start getting people experimenting with digital and come to a lunchtime computer club and start sharing tips and tricks with each other. He found it hard. He found it hard because people didn't want to invest the time, or they found it hard to everyone get to the same room at the same lunchtime, or which presentations should we share, and how would they sustain this community of practice when he leaves. So his case study is very honest. He talks about what he achieved, but he also talks about what didn't work and what we learned from that, and how for the museum to change its culture, it needs to commit. it needs to continually sustain this commitment to culture. And this commitment to a culture change has to come from the leadership team. We also learned in Brighton that many of the practitioners, some of the practitioners were frightened of using digital and had just decided it wasn't part of their job. It was too new, it was too different, it might threaten their role, and it was something else to learn. And Sophie took time. She just sat with people. She let people speak. She gave them a voice to convey why they were frightened of using digital. And so she, with them, developed this idea of, let's build courage together. What do you want to build together? And it was hard, but us realizing and seeing where the barriers were, where the emotional barriers were for some practitioners, that unlocked everything for us. That Sophie's work helped us to see why we needed to focus on the emotional dimension. And one final thing to say, Americo, from me on this would be our experience of working in the Smithsonian Institution last year was exceptional because it was atypical, because we were working at the pandemic. We didn't know when we started the project in February that by April, the UK and the US would be locked down and everyone, the researchers and all the museum staff, would be working from home. And the heads of digital media that we were working with, they were all going to be asked to pivot their entire organizations to the web, in a weekend. So they were under a great deal of strain. And so it was hard for us to conduct the project, but we carried on with the project and we learned so much about how the organization maybe communicates or doesn't communicate with each other, how in the case of the Smithsonian, there isn't a unified digital strategy. There isn't a single, there will be very soon, but at the time there wasn't a single head of digital. That different Smithsonian museums, for very good reasons, were at different points of their journey. So everything that made everything hard for us last year actually made us stronger and made the Smithsonian stronger and helped the Smithsonian to understand where its priorities need to be. So yes, just as our projects are always real and practical and always collaborative with museum practitioners, we know that we will learn more from the mistakes we made, and when we trip over, that will always happen. But maybe that always happens in research, America, as well.
Well, maybe, as you say, the pandemic brought us all into a really difficult challenge, and to assess museums from far away and not being able to sense, as we talk about affections, and when we talk about this turn, and not being able to be with people, but rather, as you say, zeros and ones in.
Yes.
I imagine that must have been much harder. And yet also the cultural differences with a museum, a Smithsonian museum and a British museum, because there are differences between those and the way the people react among the practices and the ways and the scope in the two different realities. And also something you mentioned in your talk about how to adapt the digital strategies in a national museum, which normally doesn't have a context of its own, because I mean it's wide. It serves at sometimes 50% of the visitors come from abroad, and not local visitors, and the regional small museum that is attached to the worries and the problems of the local inhabitants. So, you said that you could the system may adapt to these two different models. Is it really so? What would you recommend to a small regional museum that only has one computer? At times, that is the case in Latin America. And how can still that director that wants to change things around and wants to communicate with his people, what would you recommend him or her?
It's a fantastic question, America, and I think all the way through this process, that word contextual has been so important for us. We think the error we've been making is trying to come up with one solution for museum technology transformation. And the whole premise of One by One is this of difference. It's why the project is called One
by One. Mm-hmm.
We're going to change the museum sector, not by having one solution, but by having a million solutions. So we will change Argentinian museums one by one. Each museum will be in control of its own destiny. And that, you know, that director, she's sitting there in her rural museum, her heritage center, her volunteer-run museum, her small museum of one person and one computer. She can sit with the deck and she can say, okay, what does digital mean for me at the moment? Is it when I think of digital, you know, do I care? You know, is it just something that's happening outside? Okay, it's digital culture. It's nothing, it's not in the museum. Okay, that's her starting point. She'll put down the culture card. Or she may say, we've got this computer. I want to make more of it. You know, I can do the finances on it. I can send emails from it. But, you know, I just about have a website. What else could I be doing? I've got a filing cabinet full of collection records that only account for a quarter of the collection. Surely there's something else I can be doing. So for her, her priority might not be management processes and creating digital assets. It might just be, I just need to learn how to use that. So I'm going to put down the tool card. And maybe it's about her. You know, maybe she says, this museum relies on me. I am the museum at the moment. It will only change if I find the time and I invest in this personally and I emotionally commit to this. So this isn't about Argentinian museums and the sector. This isn't about my community of practice. This isn't even about my institution. This is about me. So she lays down a card that says, you know, digital as a tool for me. And she then says, well, what is it I need to do? You know, is it that I want to reflect upon what is the role of digital and what does good look like? She may just say, well, actually, I just want to know how to build a website, or I want to get on social media, or I just want to start putting some records on this machine so that I can hand over to the person who's going to follow me some records management that is at a professional level. So for her, it may be about the capability of knowing, well, what is a collections management system? Just by putting 3 cards down and then starting to lay on top of it, what do I need to do? Do I need to be more resilient? Do I need to be more anticipatory? Because just as I learn how to use this collections management system, I'm going to be told by the museum down the road that, the systems have moved on now, you need to upgrade. So I need to be resilient and I need to anticipate that technical will always change. So for her, just by having that conversation with herself or having a group around her to help her structure that, she can see what digital is on her terms. And she doesn't have to be intimidated by what the big national museum is telling her that she should be doing with the Internet of Things and 3D printing and XR. No, that's their journey. My journey's this. My journey will be about, over the next 2 years, developing that capability to start managing the collections in my museum, and it's on me to develop it. So that's what One by One is about. It's about helping us to develop a grammar. It's about helping us to develop a vocabulary. It's about giving us that lexicon of terms that can enable us to articulate what we want to do with our own version of digital. And change and transformation may not be part of it. You know, it's not inevitable that all museums become digital in every way. They don't have to. And for her and her museum, she maybe chooses to only use digital in certain areas, and she's in control of that. And our framework enables her to own that narrative and to own that pathway.
Well, thank you very much, Ross. I think we are moved by your talk, and I am sure that all our participants will be, and I hope we can go on doing things together, because I think there's a lot you have researched and a lot you and as a professor and the whole staff of the the professors at the faculty at Leicester Museum has a lot to give, and I hope we have the chance in Latin America to be able to see more of you all in the future. So I will also ask you to leave us some resources or some tools or some examples or some websites, some readings that in which we can follow we just have heard from you. So thank you so much, and we'll be seeing further.
Americo, thank you so much. It was a privilege to be part of the program. It's an honor to sort of be able to spend some time with you. And I know, speaking on behalf of my colleagues at the School of Museum Studies, we value this relationship, and we want this relationship to continue, and to continue to learn from you and to learn from your colleagues as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you.